speak in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Well, what a refreshing and uplifting reading, hearing about weeping and gnashing of teeth. My goodness, how very Episcopalian. So here we are again with another parable like last Sunday. Last Sunday we had the parable of the sower. And this is yet another example of one of Jesus' parables where he uses this, I'm guessing he used what was around him to illustrate with these stories, these parables, these little allegories. And these stories which have deeper meaning. And they don't have a right and wrong interpretation necessarily, but they're meant to make you think a little bit. And so, just like last Sunday, the parable of the sower, some of the seeds fell on rock and some on good soil. Well, now we have a development with another story about the good farmer who sows seed, and in the middle of the night, some baddie comes along and puts weeds in his field. Now, my guess is if you were a farmer and you had a field and someone came and did that, that's pretty bad. And I did hear a story about an Auburn fan who actually did something like that to the Alabama football field. I read it somewhere last week, and Google it and see if you can find out. There's a great story of a groundskeeper who did something quite bad in messing up the grass of the field. So I can focus today on the weeds, or I can focus today on the wheat. And perhaps in some churches today, that reading would come up and immediately the preacher would salivate at the idea of being able to preach about weeping and gnashing of teeth and bundling up weeds and throwing them in the fiery furnace of hell forever. Well, I'm kind of going in a different direction, because the thing that I take from this parable is that God calls us to find a way to coexist with the weeds of this world. And in doing so, we're called to be fully who we are called to be in the midst of the craziness and the evil around us. And certainly this week we've had just untold amounts of craziness and stress and one thing after another in conflict. Lord knows there are plenty of weeds around us right now. And so the question is, what are we going to do to find a way not to let them choke us out and hold us back? So, do you spend your life looking for weeds to pull and think that that's the way to follow God? Or do you live your life trying to find a new level of holiness and faithfulness and learn to get along with the people that are around you? In the world of the church, it's kind of an interesting thing. You tend to have some people who gather together and they see their role in the church of keeping the tradition and telling people what's right and what's wrong. And so oftentimes you'll see them developing a real critical spirit. And they'll almost shame people who are doing things in a different way. And I would say those people are behaving more like weeds than wheat by having the audacity to challenge. There are times and places to be firm, for sure. But Jesus said that the weeds would grow with the wheat until the end. And it was the judgment when all that separation stuff would happen, and that's not our job. It's not our job to clear out the field and decide which goes which way. So are you living with a critical spirit, a judging spirit, proclaiming right and wrong? Or are you trying to live faithfully, following God? A famous theologian once wrote, so you find good men and bad men in the church, But our fruits will be known not by the name we have been called, but there is more grace in becoming wheat than pulling weeds. Now, the seminary I attended over in England, we had a lot of theologians who were weed-pulling theologians. They were all about building up the church, which pulls the weeds out and builds up a community that looks more and more like its leader. But that's a church model that exists. But then there's other church models where we develop our own identity by being strong individually, and our identity is created by coming together. We become wheat rather than weeds or weed pullers. And I was joking around with my wife, who likes to cook and she loves to bake bread. She's gluten intolerant, so she's baking all these interesting recipes of bread, and she has this new bread machine. And I was joking with her, and I said, do you think you could bake a loaf of bread with a pile of weeds? And she said, it doesn't matter how hard you crush them and squish them and turn them around, you're not going to get a loaf of bread out of a bundle of weeds. And sometimes I think that people live their lives thinking that if they work hard enough and twist those old weeds long enough, that somehow they'll have a piece of bread to break at the end of that experience, and it just doesn't ever pan out that way. So I'm not sure how that relates to you and your story, but perhaps it just gives you permission to stop feeling like you've got to tend the weeds. That perhaps you can devote a little more of your energy and your time and your faith into your own depth and your own holiness. Focus on your holiness rather than judging the lack of holiness of others. If you tend to a flower, no matter how many weeds surround it, that flower will eventually bloom. I would say the easy path is the path of judgment. The hard path is the path of love. It's the path of generosity. Let me digress for just 1 second. I asked at 8:30 today, I said, do you all know what energy vampires are? And they kind of looked at me puzzled. And in all my days of coaching high school football, we used to start practice in a similar way almost every day. So this time of year, we'd be well and truly getting ready for the season. And the boys would gather around. And in Ponte Vedra, we had probably 100 to 110 kids in the program. They'd all gather around, and you would look at them and you would say, so who's going to be an energy vampire today? Because we don't need any energy vampires on this team. And the captains you would have right in front of you, and you'd say, captains, it's your responsibility to identify the energy vampires. Because we don't want energy vampires, because for this team to function effectively and well, we have to work together. And so in some ways, as a football coach, you're calling out the presence of the weeds. And you're saying, don't let the weeds prevent us from being the wheat that we're called to be the football team that we're called to be, to work together. Because those old energy vampires, they'll make a racket as long as they get attention making a racket. And they'll complain, and they'll call you up and say, goodness gracious, I don't like the way the tight end's running the drag route. And they'll be moaning and groaning. And if they don't get a reaction and they don't create friction in the team, eventually they'll stop doing it. Maybe somebody else will become the energy vampire, because that's the funny thing we found, is that the energy vampire always changes. Different people come in a bad mood, and they become the energy vampire. But a healthy organization has the ability and the responsibility, the church has a responsibility, to neutralize energy vampire behavior so that we can get on with being the people of God right here in Morganton. It's hard. It's real hard. But that's how we become the wheat that God calls us to be. We're called to be holy. You know that the word holy appears 600 times in the Bible. And if you include the words like holiness and sanctify and sanctification, 700 times in the Bible, there's a mention of the term holy and holiness. So really, you can't make sense of the Bible without understanding what it means to be holy. And God intends to make holy people who are bound to Him here in earth. And like it said at the end of the gospel, will be bound to Him in heaven eternally. And that's our hope. That's our great hope. And if we have a long-term view of life, we can have a better short-term plan for living. Let me finish with a quote. A hero of mine, who's probably a hero of many of you, John Lewis, entered glory this week. And I thought, maybe there's something that he said that would fit in with what I had prepared for this morning. And there it was, it jumped out at me, a lovely quote, which is kind of like a challenge to live up to this call of God to be wheat. John Lewis said, "Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light." Never let anyone, any person, any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Brothers and sisters, God is calling you to be a light on a lampstand in the middle of the room that gives light to everyone around you, to be a city on the hill. May we live into that courageous call that God has called us to, and that God has given John Lewis this day. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.